Well, we have most everyone here. We'll let a few more folks trickle in, but since we're 3 minutes after the hour, I think we can go ahead and get started. So for those of you new to KMI, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. And for everyone else, thank you for joining us for coming back to another webinar. So before I hand it over to you folks, let me just briefly introduce our hosts for today. We have John Hovell, who is Managing Director of Strategical International and a KMI instructor of our CKM class, as well as the Knowledge Transfer Certification course. And our guest presenter is Ed Rogers, who's the principal owner of Major Enterprises and is the former CKO of NASA. So thank you both for joining us today. And John, let me let you lead the way, sir, and I'll stop share.
All right, thanks, Eric, and welcome Ed and Lori and Brandon and everyone. This is a fun little series. I've lost count. Eric could maybe help with this. I think this may be the 4th or 5th or 6th time we've done a top 5. So it's meant to be kind of a fun, almost in the United States, we have these late night TV shows that used to do top 5 or top 10 lists. And so it's meant to be kind of funny, kind of interactive. You know, a top 5 or a top 10 list is almost purposefully meant to be content that we can debate and we can have some fun with. So separately, Ed and I pulled together at least what I feel, Ed, is kind of a sensitive, vulnerable list where I'm sharing some big failures that I've felt or seen, or at least major lessons to learn from. So I've got a few. Ed, how about you? How would you like to say hello and get started?
Good to see you again, John and Eric. See what you guys are doing and up to, and see how KMI has been coming along over the years. These things are, we all have failures, things we've either worked on or touched on or had some relationship to. And it's actually good to talk about them in terms of, practice what we preach, I guess. In other words, talk about our lessons.
All right. And so, Ed, if I share my screen, we can probably just jump right in.
Okay.
Start off. So let's go 5, 5, 4, 4, 3, 3. So if you start with your number 5, what is your number 5 KM failure to share?
Okay, so this is an interesting story. Some people who build scientific instruments, and they build them over and over again. Of course, each one's slightly different, but they wanted to learn about how to build these scientific instruments from one to another. So it's kind of an application from previous missions, previous build work to the future work. And so they called me and wanted me to find out, how should we organize our knowledge about all these scientific instruments we've built? So they said, our ideas, we don't have any other ideas. We're going to use a catalog of parts. So these are all the parts you use to build them. We're going to make a catalog, and under each part, we're going to list what it's used for. I said, well, maybe you want to think about how you actually do the work. How do you actually design and build a scientific instrument? What's the first question you ask? What's the second question you ask? What's the third question? They said, well, how would we do that? I said, well, let's get a couple of scientists in here and let's ask them. So we did. Got some scientists. Said, if you're going to build one of these things, what's the first question that comes to your mind? Well, I'd want to know what wavelength. Okay. What's the second question that comes to your mind? Well, I'd want to know what, optical systems we've required. Okay. So we just went down the list. We got there 5 or 6 or 7 questions. I said, build your system around these 5 or 6 questions. You'll help people build better instruments. They said, thank you very much, but it's cheaper to build a parts catalog. So they went off and did one, which had basically no use.
These are funny every time. Every top 5
list. I had limited authority to order them what to do. So it was basically a cost chop, and said, well, the parts catalog already exists. We'll just do that. Yours sounds interesting, but it's too hard.
Yeah, too much work. Reminds me of that. Isn't there a joke out there that's like, it's 2 lines, and the one line that says like false truths and another one that says uncomfortable truths, and everybody's in line for the false truths. Have you seen that one? It reminds me of that.
Shorter line.
All right. Shorter line. Exactly. Okay. So if I try one too, yeah, I mean, these are real for me. So number 5 is a real thing. Quarterly KM activities. I thought this was a bit of a failure. What this story is, or what happened here, large international company, we decided once a quarter to try and roll out knowledge management across the whole organization. We were going to try every 3 months to do some kind of KM activity or practice or something. So the first thing we did, and this is not to say that the approaches were failures. I want to talk about the whole thing as kind of a failure. The first thing we did was random coffee trials. So randomly asked for people that would be interested to be randomly partnered up. We randomly partnered people up. That all went pretty well. And then the second one was meant to be a little bit more conversational. We did a Yam Jam, if you're familiar with that, good old yammer.com. Asked everybody to go out on Yammer. We had some senior leaders, because it was a hierarchical organization, get on for about an hour on Yammer. And so it was a live chat with the senior leader. That wasn't quite as successful as the random coffee trial. So a downward path kind of started. And then the third thing we had is, okay, so now we're going to turn it into video. So this is the third quarter of this year. We said, we're going to ask everybody to record a very short, like 3-second video, just saying hello. We called it vid hi. It was just to like get different accents, different languages, different facial expressions, a very short say hello, and put that video as your profile. I think it was literally like 3 people out of 100,000 that did that. It was very, very small. And then the fourth idea and this is where I think the failure comes in, the momentum was lost. The fourth idea was to have an in-person and sort of blended annual knowledge management conference. And the failure was because the momentum was decreasing across each of those quarterly activities, we never had the annual conference. And so I wouldn't say knowledge management died. That's not true at all, but it was quite an unfortunate. Each event had less and less momentum as opposed to building momentum. That's my number 5. Ed, what's your 4?
Yeah, well, it's nice to see some familiar names out there in the crowd too. Some of these people know some of these stories. Yeah. So number 4 was what I called scraping emails. And this was an idea that was put forward that we could go to the email database of all the sent emails in the organization, and we could somehow harvest the information from that by keywords. We would figure out what everybody knows, sort of indirectly, by just scraping all their emails into a big algorithm. So the only question I asked when they proposed this project was, do you think after you'd launched this project, people will write their emails any differently than they did before this project was launched? They said, we don't know. I said, well, then you don't know what you're doing. Of course, they did it anyway, and it was a big failure because they got all kinds of nonsense, and people started gaming the system and post your scientific paper in your email. All of a sudden, you're an expert in all kinds of fields, and I mean, it was nonsense. That, not to mention all the legal and liability issues of privacy and everything else. This was some years ago that they ran into. People would not probably even try that today with privacy issues. But these kind of thoughts were not uncommon, especially in the early days of KM, that, hey, we could just automate all this, put USB ports in people's heads and all kinds of stuff. That was kind of the idea of how you could do it. And it was very hard to convince people of why these things wouldn't work. They pretty much all got tried multiple times and with massive failures.
Yep, that's my number 4 too. Different, wording, but same idea. Just seen lessons learned, tried so many times. I've only seen it work once in the U.S. Army at TRADOC. Other than that, really struggle with lessons learned, and I keep hearing it. Multiple clients to this day asking for lessons learned, and I very purposefully put lessons learned database there, as opposed to at least a lessons learned process. Sometimes you can get away with, especially if you rename it as something else. I don't necessarily have any very specific lessons learned story that I was going to share. I really just wanted to call out the concept. I even love, if anybody's familiar with Chris Collison and his knowledge management map that he's created, where it literally looks like a land map, and he's got all the different kind of KM techniques. Right in the middle of the map, he's got the lessons learned graveyard is on the map right in the middle, because I'll say this generically. The failure is multiple parts. It's very painful to get anybody to actually admit that they made a mistake, just like we're trying to do right now. That's painful enough. If you can get anybody to admit it, it's very painful to get them to write it down. If you can get them to write it down, it's very difficult to get it into a database or a website that's searchable. If they can get into the searchable, it's very painful to search and find anything helpful. If you can actually get it in the database and searchable and anybody finds it, it's very difficult for anybody to actually read it and you know where I'm going with this, all the way up to this whole idea of lessons applied or true lessons learned or behavior change or mindset change. Even if you're very lucky and you get all the way through all those steps of lessons learned, very low likelihood that there's going to be any behavior or mindset change after reading a document. You'll often get the not invented here. I liked reading their story, but my situation is different now. I'm going to try this thing. And unfortunately, we see it for 20 plus years now.
Oh, at least.
Ed, number 3.
Number 3. So number 3 is another one I was remotely involved in, only maybe more in the cleanup than in the actual trial. So this is just absolutely hilarious. So what these guys tried to do was they had this idea to use software and computers to simultaneously capture people's thoughts into what would end up being some database of material that would then give us a knowledge base of material about how to execute certain missions. So what they did was they got a room full of retired volunteers. So these are, the gray beards or gray haired people, whatever you're going to call them, volunteered to come in, like 20 of them, and sit in a room. They're in a room together, each one sitting at a computer with a keyboard. These keyboards are all linked through some fancy software system that was going to simultaneously capture while they typed on the keyboards, and then it would play off each other's words, and this would create a big database of keywords and all things as they typed. So here you have all these old guys sitting in this room. They're mostly old guys. And they were typing away on these computers for a whole of about 5 minutes. And they looked around the room and they said, "Hey, Joe, what?" And started talking with each other. They spent 5 minutes on the computer and they said some words I can't repeat on the air about the whole process and how they thought, what a waste of time. And they started talking with each other and had a great conversation for 2 hours about their experiences and things they'd shared and they'd learned from each other and all these years and the experience they had, none of which was captured at all because they had no means to do so. They were supposed to type everything in. So this was sort of one of these early efforts to automate capture from people that is totally people unfriendly and in fact offensive to folks. These guys were volunteers. So they said, "Why are you wasting our time to put all this stupid information in this computer? We have ideas, want to hear what we have to say or not?" Apparently not. So this sort of set us back actually for a while because we rely heavily on senior retired volunteers to come in and review a lot of the work that we would do at NASA. And so having these people basically pissed off was not a very productive use of time at all, not to mention the entire thing was scrapped and thrown away and canceled.
Yep, that's what happens, which I think is going to be similar. Mine is kind of the same where things get scrapped. Or maybe what I'd say about number 3, organizational network analysis. Again, as much as I love the process and as many successes as I've had with organizational network analysis or social network analysis, I always like to raise it as a huge risk that it's one thing. If you're not familiar with O&A, it basically looks like a spider web and it's meant to map out all of the trust or the energy or how knowledge or information flows between people. So as opposed to looking at the org chart, you're looking at the spider web view of who's connected to each other. Great idea, very mathematical, quite scientific. There's literally algorithms and formulas behind it. Where I've seen it fail too many times, I wanted to put it above lessons learned. The hype, the excitement that comes with organizational network analysis, and then the fall to, here's the beautiful spider web. So what? What do we do with it? It looks really nice. I can't tell you how many times now, a good 10 or 12 I can think of, where we put quite a bit of effort into getting, as I call the spider web, and then couldn't quite analyze it, couldn't quite understand it, and a little bit like lessons learned, really struggled to take any noticeable action from the map. Again, not to say there haven't been times where we have been lucky. I felt sensitive putting in here, but more and more times I'm noticing really struggling with real action, real change coming from quite an extended or expensive effort of O&A.
Yeah, sometimes
number 2.
It can be the shiny object, which is gets people's attention. And like these other examples, people, they like to actually do things, because they feel like you're actually making some progress rather than actually thinking about what are you doing. And that I think is part of the common theme in some of these.
Yep.
Number 2, I had an interesting, what I call the misapplication of lessons learned. So you talk about people who can't put things into databases. Then we have the people who respond on the other side who say, I'm going to go through the lessons learned database and tick every lesson that we checked every single one of them. We followed every single one of them. So in this mission, a lesson was written in a lessons learned database about a particular application of a piece of hardware and software to combine. And the lesson was denoted and applied to the next mission where this piece was used. However, the application was slightly different than where it had been used in the first mission. And so the lesson actually caused an error in the transfer of data between other components in the satellite, which resulted in a mission-ending error to the mission based on the application of lessons learned without thinking about it. In other words, it became a checkbox activity. There's a lesson, we did it, we checked. There's a lesson, we did it, we checked. There's a lesson, we did it, we checked. Rather than, here's a lesson, what does that tell us? What should we think about it? How should that affect what we're doing? What can we learn from it? And then use it as a part of our thinking process rather than just tick the box. And you see this also, people just check a box because we checked the lesson. In this case, it was actually a mission-ending millions of dollars loss based on a rote application of lessons, which sometimes you get the wrong lesson from lessons learned, even if you do use it. You still have to think.
Still some effort there, yeah. Okay, I'm going to do my number two, and really this probably should be my number one. This is the one I am most nervous about. This one is a true, when the votes came in, Eric at KMI asked all of you and all the whole KMI community, what would, this top 5 thing seems to be kind of fun and it's got some interest and it's got some momentum. What would you like to see as the topics? And we're just going through what got the most votes. And so we've been through several others. Failures, many people said, I want to hear real failures. Well, here's the one that is my biggest failure, my personal biggest KM failure in my KM career. And so I am not proud of this. I'm quite embarrassed by it. Real emotions come from me on this one, but I'll share a real quick version of it. In a KM kind of way, funny enough, it's actually a huge success. There was a large organization formed a bit of a new KM department. They had lost a major contract, and so unfortunately they were having to lay off quite a percentage of their organization. So they said, hey, we've heard about this knowledge retention thing. Could you come in and do that knowledge retention thing? And so sure enough, we did. You're welcome, Tammy. We did it. And yeah, my heart even starts racing because this is just this is years ago and it's still so fresh for me. We ended up winning an internal award for that work. So the knowledge management, knowledge retention, knowledge transfer effort was quite a success, measured to be 91% of unique and critical knowledge maintained in organizational memory. Such a success that the CEO's annual awards were handed to that KM team for that knowledge retention effort. Here's the really sensitive part. As you can see on screen, failed change management, more so than knowledge management. How do I want to tell this part? Other people have different perspectives on this. My personal perspective was after the team won the award, we were no longer invited to other projects. It was like we were the spoiled children. It's like we were the special bunch that, oh, look at how great they are. Don't involve them. They'll just come in and save everything and change everything. Like, did you kind of get what I'm trying to sensitively say here? So while the project itself went great, I think my biggest failure was staying in communications, doing change management. My hands are shaky. Involving people beyond the project so that there were fewer surprises, fewer feelings of exclusion and power dynamics. That the KM went well, but I guess I'm trying to say I learned I need to think a little bit bigger than KM. So.
Very good, John. Thanks for sharing.
Thanks.
I can relate in some way. I resisted many years of my years of 17 years in NASA in taking on authority as a KM position precisely because of some of what you just shared. Once you get authority, people treat you very differently. Whereas if you're an influence, then you sort of have to earn your right to work with them. And then if they do invite you, so it's a very different relationship. I can say if I ran into some buzzsaws there. Yeah. So where are we up to? Number one?
Number one. Sorry, I should have done a drum roll before putting it on here. Let's try it again.
Number one.
Ed, what is your big number one?
Here's my all-time favorite. lessons learned, knowledge management sort of failure. So we spent a lot of time there's a recurring sets of missions. Some missions get repeated where new versions of satellites are built. So these contracts are relet after 5-10 years. They're similar. So they're building a new improved, but a copy of the old, or what the function is of satellites are. And so these are hundreds of millions of dollars of satellites. And so we had a set of these contracts that went forward and had a lot of problems. Big cost overruns, delays, the normal kind of stuff you might think happens. So we had a lot of investigation, a lot of collecting knowledge, lessons, what happened, what went right, what went wrong, what could we learn from all of this. So we wrote all of this up and detailed a lot of it in terms of how the project was managed and things, knowledge was shared and the information requirements were managed, all the sort of usual stuff. End of the day, the contract overran and it was a fixed price contract. So the contractor ate, we don't know, estimates were anywhere as high as $100 million, say $10 to $100 million. They ate on this contract because it was a fixed price contract and they had to deliver. After we did all of our work and put together all the story and what we should learn from this and how we should reiterate that, the lessons we learned from all this mission, headquarters got a hold of it and said, wait, it overran and the contractor had to pay $100 million? Let's do that again. Reissue the same contract so we do that again. Let's repeat that. I'm like, what? Want to repeat a complete mess? Well, but it was good. See, the outcome was financially, they thought that was a great thing to do. I said, the only person who's going to bid on this contract is someone who has no idea what they're doing. The contractor who performed the work now knows how to actually build this satellite properly. They learned on their own dime at their expense. They're the only ones who actually know what it takes. They're not going to bid because they know this bid is ridiculous. You're going to get an incompetent, well, of course, is what they did. Because it looked good on paper, it saved money. So all the work we did was completely tossed. And the only lesson learned was the contractor had to eat money. Let's do that again. That'll make us look good. So sometimes it's really hard to fight knowledge and wisdom.
There's quite a pattern of wasted time, wasted money, and I don't want to say wasted energy, but like unfortunate energy, negative energy. I think my number one is very similar. I don't know if this is often on these top fives. I joke that it's a bit of a cop out, and my number two was a very real story, and I told it as safely and as gently as I could. My number one is real, but it's also, I don't know, somehow a bit of a cop out. I really think if I tried to sleep on this and, we had a couple months to think about it. Me personally, I think the biggest failure in KM is calling it KM. I'm not sure it is knowledge management. I'm not sure it's knowledge leadership. I'm not sure it's collaboration services. I'm not sure it's knowledge services. I'm not sure it's organizational learning. I'm not sure it has a label. And I think the big failure is we see people over and you see in conferences, you see in job titles, you see in just chatting about knowledge management that it is such a blurred. Is it content management? Is it information management? Is it information technology? Is it document management? Is it tacit? Is it implicit? Is it explicit? What kind of?
Yes,
I think to this day, the understanding of KM and even the people doing it for a long time. It's maybe the last thing I'll say is the final joke there of like, you get 5 knowledge management people in a room and ask them each their definition. You won't get 5 definitions of knowledge management from 5 people. You'll get 10 definitions of knowledge management from 5 people. And part of us are proud of it because it's such an ambiguous and complex and somewhat powerful that way. But I'm going to chalk it up as a failure as I've seen other fields like organization development struggle with their definition and getting buy-in and making real impact because it is just so difficult. I heard your yes there, Ed.
Yeah, you tend to lose relevance when you become everything meaningless. So right
tricky.
On.
Really, really tricky. So now, as we always like to do, and look at this, Ed, we're right at the 30-minute mark. It's perfect. A little bit of overview context, and then we'd love to send everybody into breakouts because Ed and I humbly, vulnerably shared our personal top 5. There's tremendous knowledge in this room too. We would love to put you into small breakouts and have you agree or disagree with our lists, or of course, whatever pops up for you. What is your top 5 failures, or what is your top 1 failure that you might be willing to share. So the context we've kind of pulled together is just like we do in every top 5, we try to figure out, well, top 5 KM failures, that's a big question. What do we mean by that? Did we mean Ron Hovell's KM failures? Did we mean Ed Rogers? Did we mean like personal KM failures, like ones that we've been a part of? Did we mean KM failures that we've read about or heard at a conference or, talked to someone else and it was like, it's an old classic, a little bit like the lessons learned one? Or are we talking about the whole discipline of KM, like I tried to do in my number 1? Or is it a specific, here was a project or a task type of KM failure? If that helps you think about some of your own examples or failures, let's just call it what it is. Anything you'd add to that, Ed?
No, it's good. I mean, personal stories are always the best. So if people could share their own personal stories, I'm sure that'd be very stimulating to one another.
Like it. All right. So I'm going to click the buttons here. I know a lot of people always kind of have to drop at the halfway mark, which is another reason we start the breakouts now. So if anybody needs to drop, now's a great time. Otherwise, I think I'll do groups of 4. So it's not too big, not too small. And if anybody has to drop, that's fine too. So 1 second while I click the buttons. And the prompt question for you will be, what is your biggest KM failure or a related story that you might like to share? And I am ready. So let's do like 12 minutes in this first round. And then my thinking is we'll probably just come back and I'll discuss it together. So here we go. What is your top knowledge management failure? See you back in 12 minutes. Enjoy. Welcome, John. We're closing breakouts literally right now, so everybody will be back in 60 seconds. We're talking about, as you probably saw, everyone's biggest knowledge management failures. So let's see what people share when they come back. All right. You're on your way back to the main room. Great to see some smiling faces. Yeah, welcome back. What we're thinking is for the last 10 minutes or so, we'll just open it up full group. Anybody hear any failures worth sharing or stories or examples? Or Ed, what would you sort of recommend at this point?
Well, I think it's interesting that a lot of these things come from misapplication of otherwise what might have at least a germ of a good idea, and the inability to think through either consequences or specific application. Like that may be a great thing for this group, but it doesn't apply to us. We need to do something that fits our business model, our business process. And we kind of know that to be true, but we just kind of sort of lost sight of that in KM. There's a lot of rush to build SharePoints for everybody, build databases for everybody, sort of slap on solutions. And I think we've wasted a lot of time and money over the years doing that kind of thing. And as we get more mature, we find out, what do we need? What are we trying to do? What's the simplest, most efficient way to actually do that at the lowest level? Lessons we've all learned in management and change management from decades, but we took a long time to apply to knowledge management. Somehow we thought we were different.
Yep. So yeah, wide open. Anybody hear a great story or want to share their own? I realize it's a brand new group, but Dorothy, maybe?
What I'm still discovering is that folks are still struggling with understanding knowledge management in general, the true definition, its function. And even talking when we broke off in the breakout session, myself and Chris, we were talking about, people just not understanding the full definition of knowledge management. So I'm still discovering, okay, we're still trying to narrow down that definition. And as far as failures, talking about the lessons learned, I shared that in the breakout that, I tried doing some lesson learned sessions and folks were hesitant to, share if they had learned the lesson or even ask a question. So the meetings became so minute that they just eventually faded away.
Yep.
Because they still don't know what to do with the data.
Or the information or the knowledge. All of it.
Right. Don't even know the process tied to the data, So it's so much that they still have to understand to fully implement knowledge management.
Yep.
And then you have the issue of who owns it, who's guiding it.
Yes.
So I'll tell a real quick funny story, John. So I went to an organization that invited me to speak, and I presented I had a paper with the 10 top myths of KM, things that people do wrong. And my number one at the end of the day, the big was don't hand KM to the IT department or the CIO or the CIO. Of course, as soon as I got done presenting, the CIO got up and was introduced as the KM champion for the organization.
Yep.
That's kind of what happened to me.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that was rather interesting. I did not get invited back to that group. Personal failure to do research.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks, Dorothy. Thanks, Amanda. Saw the reaction there. See the chat popping up a little bit too.
If I could speak, so my breakout group, we started our story sort of started to show a little bit of a balancing act. So I think there were two people who talked about how there was not enough executive buy-in, and that's great. My story generally was that I actually had too much executive buy-in, and they used that for scope creep. And then, but the other, on the other axes, we also started talking about how if you dangle these workflows or the data improvements, then you start to get put into these other pools of data management or workflow management or something like that. And so trying to balance on two, basically on the head of a pin to do knowledge management, that was a sort of a recurring thing that we all said. It just that we were coming from different directions.
Resonates with me too. Got one client I can think of right now with quite a bit of scope creep. Kind of agree to one thing and they're loving knowledge management so much that it's the opposite failure. It's the too much success as a failure. Keep delivering everything. Komozo?
Thank you for the session. Really appreciative of that. I actually just came across it by chance while I was looking for knowledge management information on the net. So for me, I actually shared with, I think it was Alex and Jen in our breakout room, that for us, the biggest failure in our organization on KM was or is establishing a KM function. We are on the third, if not the fourth iteration of establishing a KM function. Well, I just joined the team now, but I found out through the years, there's been KM function that has been created or established, but it after a couple of years, it will be dissolved because they don't see the value or the ROI on KM. And I think for us, we just try, at the moment, we're trying to just ensure that we show the value to the business on KM. And Alex really shared some valuable information on what we can try to ensure that this time around we stick.
It'll be different this time. Learning each time. Thank you, Komozo, and thank you, Dan. Alex, do you mind sharing any of the?
No, yeah, that's. I'm glad to share. And I think one of the things we talked about was that unfortunately, I've actually been to a couple organizations and seen this fail twice actually before I came to my current organization, and the big reason is that I think it's hard to prove that this is more than a nice to have, right? So one of the clear things I did when I got to my current organization is I sat down and we looked at how can we prove our ROI, right? How can we prove that this knowledge management is not just a nice to have, it's not just a hobby, right? This is something that we're going to save the business money with, right? So from our perspective, what we did is we laid out three 3 to 4 measurables. And we said, for instance, like we're going to track the clicks, we're going to track the surveys, we're going to track the and then what we did is we started to relate that into like call deflection, things like that. So proving our business case. So that way, here we are 3 years down the road, we're not looked at as a nice to have anymore. We are an essential part of the business. And, not only that, we've also started to drive other points of revenue as well through the KM. Which is neither here nor there, but it's nice to have that ability to say, hey, we're not just a hobby, this is and to do that, we actually picked it through our, there were some very specific measurables we looked at. One of the biggest things I think I got us improve on is looking at customer feedback. How do we get more of that, right? So I think that's something I would come to the table with is, how do you get your external customers to be more, I guess, verbose and let you know that the content we're putting out there is useful. So.
And the conversations, being in conversations with your stakeholders or your customers or your taxpayers or your warfighters or, whatever your audience is.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Alex. Probably time for one more. Any final story, final failure, final kudos or thanks to anyone else that you heard in your small group that you just wanted to say thanks for? If not, Ed, I think I'm not sure Eric or Lori has anything to add. I think it's just a big thank you for dialing in, and hope you kind of enjoy the top 5 series, and we'll go back to the votes. And Eric, I think we're probably due. I think we're starting to run out of the 5 or 6, 7 top votes we had. So you may get a survey again soon for the next round of top 5 series. And Ed,
lots of fun.
Huge thank you.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to talk about all this stuff and lots of memories. As I said, some familiar names and faces out there, people we've run across in the past. So it's good to work with you again, John and Eric. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you, Ed. See you all later. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.